On Christmas Eve, I found my only daughter locked outside on the porch, shivering violently in a thin dress, while inside her in-laws raised their glasses and laughed by the fire. Snow clung to her shoulders, her lips turned blue, each breath shallow as if life itself was slipping away. Through the glass, music and laughter echoed like knives twisting in my chest. They treated her suffering as entertainment, her pain as nothing more than a cruel joke. They thought wealth and power would hide their sins forever. But what they didn't know was that night they awakened something far worse than shame, a father who had spent 30 years hunting monsters. And this time, the monsters were them. What ending do you think the cruel ones in this story deserve? Share your thoughts below and let me know where you're watching from. The taxi's tires hissed softly on the snow-dusted streets of Beacon Hill, a sound swallowed by the festive silence of Christmas Eve. I watched the gas lamps blur past the window, their warm glow catching the intricate ironwork of the historic townhouses. Each home was a perfect picture postcard, adorned with wreaths and ribbons, their windows spilling golden light onto the pristine snow. A familiar warmth spread through my chest, a mix of nostalgia and anticipation. After 6 long months on the road, trying to figure out what a retired homicide detective does with the rest of his life, I was finally here. I was home, or at least, the closest thing to it since Martha passed. I was going to surprise Olivia. I paid the driver and stepped out the biting Boston air. Pulling the collar of my worn leather jacket tighter, the Vance residence stood before me, a grand, 4-story brownstone that always seemed more like a museum than a home. It projected wealth and power, just like the family who lived inside it. Through the enormous parlor window, I could see the towering Christmas tree, dripping with crystal ornaments and shimmering lights. The silhouette of a grand piano was visible, and I could almost hear the faint, cheerful notes of a holiday carol. I smiled, picturing Olivia's face, that radiant smile that could cut through the gloomiest Boston winter day, the one that always reminded me so much of her mother. I imagined her surprise, then the warmth of her hug, a feeling I'd missed more than I cared to admit. I walked up the stone steps, my old boots making no sound on the freshly shoveled path. I decided against the grand front door, opting for the side path that led toward the back garden. I wanted to peek, to catch a glimpse of the family celebration before I announced my arrival. As I drew closer to the rear of the house, the sound of laughter drifted out from a large bay window overlooking the patio. It was deep, hearty laughter, the kind that should have been infectious. But something was wrong. The tone was sharp, edged with a cruelty that made the hairs on my arms stand up. My old cop instincts, dormant for months, flickered to life. I pressed myself into the shadows of a large frozen fir tree. The voice belonged to William Vance, Olivia's father-in-law, a retired federal judge whose portrait probably hung in every courthouse in the state. 4 times, he boomed, and another wave of laughter followed. You'd think she'd get the message by now. Some women just aren't built to carry on a legacy. My blood ran cold. Then Caleb, my son-in-law, his voice smooth and venomous. She's more useful as a tax write-off. Father, at least her artistic pursuits give Margaret something to talk about at her charity luncheons. The cackle that followed was a physical blow. They were talking about my daughter, my Olivia. They were mocking her miscarriages. My breath hitched in my throat, a knot of pure fury tightening in my gut. I was about to storm in there, to smash through that perfect, polished facade. But then I heard another sound, a faint, desperate whimper that was almost lost in the wind. It came from the covered porch just off the kitchen. I moved toward it, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. And then I saw her, curled on an old wicker chair, tucked away in the deepest shadows. Was Olivia? She was wearing nothing but a thin silk dress, the kind she might wear to a dinner party. Her arms were wrapped around herself, her frail shoulders shaking uncontrollably in the freezing air. Snowflakes had melted in her hair, sticking it to her pale forehead. Her face was buried in her knees, but I could hear the choked, silent sobs. She was just feet away from the warmth and laughter, cast out into the cold like she was nothing. My world tilted on its axis. The detective in me died, and the father roared to life. I ran to her, my voice a broken whisper in the cold night air. Live. Her head lifted slowly, and her eyes, vacant and dull with pain, finally focused on my face. For a moment, the world was just the sound of my daughter's broken gasp, a sound that ripped through me with the force of a bullet. There was no time for questions, no time for anything but instinct. I tore off my heavy leather jacket and wrapped it around her shivering frame, the cold from her skin seeping through my shirt like death itself. She was lighter than I remembered, fragile as a broken doll. I scooped her into my arms, her head falling limp against my shoulder. Her soaked satin slippers fell off, landing silently in the snow behind us. I turned toward the house, each step fueled by a cold, precise rage I hadn't felt since my days on the force. I didn't knock. I pushed the heavy oak door open with my shoulder. It swung inward with a dull thud that silenced the room. The cheerful Christmas music stuttered and died. The laughter froze on their faces. I stood in the doorway, a ghost from a world they tried to ignore, holding the evidence of their cruelty in my arms. Every eye in that opulent, suffocatingly warm room turned to me. Margaret Vance was the first to speak, her perfectly painted smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Jason, goodness, what a surprise," she said, her voice a tinkling bell of forced pleasantry. She glanced at the daughter-in-law in my arms with a flash of annoyance. "Not concern? Surprise isn't the word I'd use." "Margaret," I growled, my voice low and dangerous. I stepped fully into the room, letting the door swing shut behind me. The scent of roasted pine and rich food was nauseating. "I found my daughter freezing to death on your porch. You have 60 seconds to explain what the hell is going on." Caleb emerged from behind his mother, a half-empty glass of champagne in his hand. He looked me up and down, a contemptuous smirk playing on his lips. "She's just looking for attention, as usual," he sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You should have taught her to be stronger. Old man." Those two words, old man, were a lit match to a barrel of gasoline. I felt Olivia flinch in my arms, a small wounded sound escaping her lips. "You will not speak to me like that," I said, my voice dropping even lower, each word honed to a razor's edge. "And you will never speak about her like that again." I took a step toward him, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than arrogance in his eyes. It was the brief, fleeting fear of a predator that has just realized it cornered the wrong animal. It was then that the true king of the den made his move. Judge William Vance rose from his armchair by the fire, his presence commanding the room's absolute silence. He wasn't angry. He was something far worse. He was disappointed, like a god interrupted during his divine leisure. "That's enough, Jason," he said, his voice calm and layered with unquestionable authority. "This is a private family matter. Olivia's overly emotional. She needed some air." "Air," I repeated, my voice cracking with disbelief. "It's 30 degrees out there. This isn't air, William. This is abuse." He waved a dismissive hand. "You're being dramatic. Now, put her down. You're making a scene in front of our guests." I looked from his cold, dead eyes to Caleb's smug face, then to Margaret's icy indifference. There was no humanity here, no soul. This wasn't a family, it was a den of vipers. I held Olivia tighter, her faint breath a reminder of what was at stake. "You're right about one thing," I said. "Turning my back on them, I am making a scene, and I'm taking my daughter home." I walked toward the front door without another glance. The stunned silence behind me was more satisfying than any shout, but as my hand touched the doorknob, Caleb's voice, a cold whisper of venom, cut through the air. "You have no idea what you've just done." The drive back to my small apartment in the North End was a silent, suffocating affair. I carried Olivia inside, just as I had when she was a little girl who'd fallen asleep in the car. My apartment wasn't a mansion, it was small, filled with old books, worn furniture, and the lingering scent of her mother's lavender. It was a home. It was safe. I settled her onto the sofa, draping her mother's old Afghan over her shoulders. She was still trembling, a tremor that came from a place far deeper than the winter cold. I made her tea, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind replayed the scene at the house. Each sneer, each cruel word. I placed the warm mug in her hands. She just stared into the steam, her eyes 1,000 miles away. I waited. A detective knows that silence often speaks louder than any question. Hours passed. Finally, her voice, so small it was almost a thought, cut through the stillness. "It wasn't just tonight, Dad." "I know, sweetheart," I said softly, my heart twisting. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You don't. She took a shaky breath. It started small. The way he'd talk down to me in front of his parents. The way he'd tell me my ideas for the house were tasteless. He made me quit my design work, said it was a distraction, that my only job was to give him an heir. She clutched the mug tighter, her knuckles white. He took my credit cards, gave me an allowance, like a child. If I spent too much, he'd lock himself in his study and not speak to me for days. The silence it was worse than the yelling. My fists clenched at my sides. I had seen this pattern before, in interview rooms with battered women who were convinced they deserved it. I never imagined I'd see it in my own daughter. The miscarriages, she choked on the word, after each one. He'd say it was my fault, that my body was weak, defective. Her eyes finally met mine, and in them, I saw a universe of pain and terror. The last one, it wasn't an accident. I froze, the air leaving my lungs. What are you talking about? Liv, we were arguing, she whispered, the words tumbling out now, desperate to escape. He'd found a receipt for a new canvas I'd bought. He called me a worthless, barren woman who was wasting his money. Her voice broke. He grabbed my arm. He was squeezing so hard. I tried to pull away. I was at the top of the stairs, and he pushed me. The mug slipped from her fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor, but I didn't hear it. All I could hear was her confession. He pushed me, but it was what she said next that turned my blood to ice. When I was on the floor, he didn't rush to help me. Dad, he just stood over me. His eyes were so cold. She was sobbing openly now, her body shaking, and he said, "Look what you made me do. If you ever tell anyone this wasn't an accident, I will destroy your father. I will make sure he has nothing left." In that moment, the father in me wanted to burn the world down. But the detective, the cold, patient part of me that had hunted monsters for 30 years, took over. I knelt in the shards of the broken mug, taking her trembling hands in mine. The target was no longer just Caleb. It was his entire corrupt world. "He will pay for this, Olivia," I said, my voice quiet, but with the deadly calm of a promise that could never be broken, not just for what he did to you, but for daring to threaten my family. I swear on your mother's soul, I will tear them down to the foundations. The next morning, my rage had congealed into something colder, heavier purpose. I left Olivia sleeping and made the only call I could. An hour later, I was tucked into a dark corner of a bustling North End cafe with David Chen, my old partner. He listened intently as I laid it all out, the Christmas Eve discovery, the push down the stairs, and the threat against me. His professional calm cracked, his jaw tightening. "That son of a bitch," he breathed. "We can have uniforms at his door in an hour." I shook my head. "No. His father is retired Judge Vance. They'll bury it in procedure and paint Olivia as unstable. We'd be bringing a knife to a war that's already been rigged." David nodded grimly, pulling out a slim, unmarked laptop. "Then we don't play by their rules." His fingers flew across the keyboard, the soft clicks a stark contrast to the loud chatter of the cafe. "Let's see what the golden boy is hiding." He worked in silence, walking down dark digital alleys I no longer had access to. Publicly, Caleb Vance was a saint, a philanthropist, an investor, a pillar of the community. But David wasn't looking at the front door. He was picking the lock on the back window. Suddenly, he froze. "I'm in," he whispered, showing me the screen. On it was a file from the old city server archives, heavily encrypted but not invisible to a wizard like David. Vance Financial, 2016. Allegations of securities fraud. My heart hammered against my ribs. Case was dropped. David continued. Key witness recanted his testimony. And guess who the presiding judge was who dismissed the case, right before his retirement? I didn't need him to answer. William Vance. David looked up, the grim truth settling between us. "We can't take him to court. Jason, his father is the court. They own the system." I stared past him, my path suddenly clear. The old ways, the ones bound by badges and laws, were useless here. I needed to return to an even older way, the way of the hunter. "Then we don't use the system," I said, a dangerous idea taking root. "We use their own greed against them. You told me you could create a ghost online, someone who doesn't exist. Let's build one." 2 weeks later, the ghost was born. I stood in David's apartment, a chaotic nest of monitors and wires that hummed with quiet power. His name was Klaus Richter, a reclusive German billionaire with a portfolio as impressive as it was untraceable. David had spent 14 sleepless nights building him from scratch. He had a Swiss bank account with a carefully aged transaction history, a shell corporation registered in the Caymans, and a digital footprint so pristine it screamed old money. There were fleeting mentions of him in archived articles from obscure European financial journals, all digitally inserted by David. Klaus Richter was a phantom, but he was the most believable phantom in the world. "Time to cast the line," David said, his eyes tired but sharp. He didn't send a simple email, he dropped a breadcrumb, a single encrypted message on a highly exclusive online forum for hedge fund managers, a digital country club Caleb was known to frequent. The message was subtle, mentioning a new European fund looking for an aggressive, high-yield American partner. It didn't name Caleb, but it described his exact profile. It was bait-tailored specifically for his ego. We waited. For 3 days. There was nothing. I spent the time with Olivia, watching the color slowly return to her cheeks, a quiet resolve hardening in her eyes. She never asked about my plans, but she knew I had them. She trusted me. That trust was the fuel that kept my cold rage burning. On the 4th day, David called. "We have a nibble." I was at his apartment in 10 minutes. On one of his screens was an email. Caleb, using a secure server, had reached out to the intermediary address David had set up. His tone was cautious but dripping with self-importance. He listed his accomplishments, his firm's recent successes. He was auditioning, trying to prove he was worthy of Klaus Richter's attention. "He's doing his due diligence now," David explained, pointing to another screen showing incoming tracer pings, running searches, checking databases. "He'll find exactly what we want him to find." A week later, the second email arrived. The tone had shifted. It was eager, almost desperate. He'd swallowed the bait whole. He proposed a preliminary discussion, suggesting his complete discretion and commitment. David crafted the reply under my watchful eye. Klaus Richter was impressed, but he was a man who valued privacy above all else. He didn't do video calls. He didn't do phone calls. He did business face-to-face, in a place of his choosing, with absolute secrecy. He proposed a meeting at a private suite in a discreet Boston hotel for the following week. We sent the email and waited. My heart a slow, steady drum. The response came in less than an hour. A single sentence from Caleb Vance. "Name the time." "I'll be there." David leaned back, a grim smile touching his lips. He looked at me. "The fish is on the line. Jason." 1 week later, I was watching ghosts on a screen from the adjoining hotel suite. David and I monitored the video feed from 3 micro cameras hidden in the meeting room next door. The man playing Klaus Richter was a former undercover cop David trusted with his life. He was perfect calm, imposing, with an accent that was vaguely European and impossible to place. He sat in an armchair, patiently reviewing a file. Waiting, the bait was set, right on time. The door opened. My breath caught. It wasn't just Caleb. Walking in behind him, carrying an air of absolute authority, was Judge William Vance. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. "2 birds with 1 stone, Mr. Richter," Caleb began, his voice smooth as oil. "This is my father, William. He acts as my personal counsel on sensitive ventures." "I see," Klaus said, not standing up. He gestured to the chairs opposite him. "Please." For 20 minutes, they talked business. Klaus laid out the proposal, a massive, legally ambiguous investment that would double Caleb's fortune, but required creative accounting. As they discussed the details, I saw the greed glittering in Caleb's eyes. He was completely hooked. Then, Klaus made his move. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. My only hesitation, "Gentlemen, is the risk. An operation of this nature, it creates enemies. It creates loose ends. I once read about a case here in Boston, a securities fraud allegation that simply vanished. I need to know that you can handle such complications." He had just dangled the bait from their past right in front of them. William Vance smiled, a thin reptilian smile. "Complications can always be managed with the right influence, Mr. Richter. That particular case you mentioned involved, let's say, an overzealous employee and a witness who was persuaded to see things more clearly. It was a simple matter of procedure." Caleb chuckled, leaning back in his chair with unbearable arrogance. My father taught me that there are no problems, only solutions. The key is having the stomach to implement them. My hand tightened into a fist. David put a calming hand on my shoulder. We've got them, his eyes said. Let them finish. Klaus nodded slowly. And what of personal complications, unreliable people within one's own family? For instance, they can be the most dangerous loose ends of all. Caleb's smile tightened, a cruel edge entering his voice. You mean like a wife who becomes a liability? He glanced at his father, sharing a dark understanding. My wife, for example, is emotionally fragile, prone to accidents. He said the word with a chilling emphasis. She is a nuisance my father and I have learned to manage effectively. She knows her place. She knows to keep her mouth shut, lest things get worse for the people she cares about. He was talking about me. He was admitting to the threat. The hidden camera zoomed in slightly on William Vance's face. The retired judge showed no emotion. Every family has its burdens. Mr. Richter, he said, his voice flat and cold. The important thing is ensuring those burdens don't threaten the foundation of the house. David hit a single key on his laptop. The screen flashed green. Recording secure. I looked at the two men on the monitor, so confident in their power, so assured of their untouchability. They had just signed their own death warrants. I didn't feel triumph. I felt the cold, clean satisfaction of a lock clicking into place. The trap was sprung. A few nights later, I stood in the shadows of a service balcony, an unseen ghost watching the Grand Theater below. The Copley Plaza's ballroom was a masterpiece of gilded plaster and crystal. Tonight, filled with the soft hum of Boston's most powerful voices, they drifted across the marble floor, a glittering sea of tuxedos and designer gowns, their laughter echoing the clink of champagne flutes. This was the Vance family's kingdom, a court built on influence and meticulously crafted appearances, and tonight I was here to watch it burn. From my perch, I could see them all. Margaret, a queen in emerald silk, accepting compliments with practiced grace. Caleb, my son-in-law, moving through the crowd with the predatory confidence of a young prince. And at the podium on the main stage, bathed in a warm, reverent spotlight, stood the king himself, Judge William Vance. I checked my watch. My heartbeat is slow. Steady drum against my ribs. 2 floors up, in a small control room overlooking the plaza. David was ready. My phone buzzed silently in my pocket. A single word from David. Showtime. On stage, Judge Vance tapped the microphone, his rich, authoritative voice silencing the room. My friends, he began, his arms spread wide in a gesture of magnanimous benevolence. In these trying times, it is our moral obligation to uphold the very pillars of our society, pillars of integrity, of truth, and above all, of justice. As the word justice hung in the air, charged with his hypocrisy, the 2 enormous projector screens flanking the stage flickered. The golden Vance family crest dissolved, replaced by the stark, black and white image of a hotel suite. A confused, delicate murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't part of the program. Then the video began. Their own voices. Caleb's. Williams erupted from the state-of-the-art sound system, cold and clear as a winter night. The polite smiles in the audience froze. I watched as they heard William Vance, the paragon of judicial virtue, boast about how he'd made a securities fraud case simply vanish. The murmur grew louder, laced now with whispers of shock. Then came Caleb's arrogant chuckle about having the stomach to implement solutions. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. The air grew thick, heavy. The polite fiction that held this world together was being torn apart, thread by thread, right before their eyes. Then came the final, devastating blow. The hidden camera's view on the screen zoomed in on Caleb's smug face as he spoke of his wife, my daughter, the liability, the woman prone to accidents. The crowd heard him admit, in his own chilling words, to managing her, to ensuring she kept her mouth shut. The final nail was Judge Vance's cold pronouncement, a statement that stripped away his mask of benevolence and revealed the monster beneath. Every family has its burdens. The important thing is ensuring those burdens don't threaten the foundation of the house. A collective, horrified gasp sucked the air from the room. A woman in a diamond necklace dropped her champagne flute, the sound of it shattering on the marble floor, the only sound in a cathedral of sudden. Dead silence. I looked at the stage. William Vance's face was the color of ash. He stared at the screens, his mouth slightly agape. A man watching his own execution in real time. Caleb stood paralyzed beside him, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief, turning to pure, impotent rage. I saw him scan the room, looking for who to blame. But he was surrounded. The faces that had adored him moments before now stared at him with dawning horror and cold, unforgiving judgment. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I didn't need to see the reporters rush in or the first person turn their back on them. The foundation of their house hadn't just been threatened, it had been utterly demolished. I turned and walked away from the balcony, the first sirens wailing in the distance, a fitting score for the end of an empire. The morning after the gala, the story wasn't just news, it was a contagion. The video David had released to a handful of journalists went viral before sunrise. A digital wildfire that consumed the Vance name with a ferocity no amount of money or influence could ever hope to extinguish. It was the only thing anyone in Boston was talking about. The first domino fell before the morning coffee had even cooled. The State Bar Association, in an unprecedented emergency session, moved for the immediate and permanent disbarment of William Vance. His portrait was quietly taken down from the hallowed halls of Harvard Law. The charities he once lorded over issued brisk, sterile statements disavowing him, their words a frantic attempt to distance themselves from the stench of his corruption. The reporters who once quoted him with reverence now camped outside his Beacon Hill mansion like vultures, their cameras hungry for a shot of the fallen king. The second domino, much louder and more catastrophic, was Caleb. His investment firm, Vance Financial, didn't just falter, it evaporated. A tidal wave of panic selling wiped out its stock value in the opening bell. The SEC, armed with the irrefutable evidence from our video, reopened the 2016 securities fraud case with a vengeance that suggested they'd been waiting for this moment for years. Federal agents, grim-faced and efficient, raided their gleaming downtown offices before lunch, carrying out boxes of documents under the ravenous gaze of news cameras. Caleb's face was on every screen, no longer the handsome boy genius of finance, but the poster child for a rot that ran deep in the city's heart. But the justice I cared about most was the one that couldn't be measured in stock prices or headlines. With the public outcry at a fever pitch, the district attorney's office fast-tracked a criminal investigation into the domestic abuse. Olivia, wrapped in her mother's old Afghan on my sofa, gave her statement over the phone. Her voice, once so fragile, was now calm, clear, and unbreakable. She laid out the facts of her abuse with a precision that would have made me proud in a courtroom, armed with her testimony and the video in which Caleb effectively confessed to his methods of managing her. They issued a warrant for his arrest. I didn't watch it on TV. Olivia and I were in my small living room, the winter light soft through the windows, when David sent me a single photo. It was a news snapshot of Caleb, his perfectly tailored suit rumpled, being led from his office in handcuffs. His face was a mask of utter disbelief, the slack-jawed shock of a god who had just been told he was mortal. There was no smugness left, no arrogance, only the pathetic, raw bewilderment of a man who truly believed the rules never applied to him. The Vance Empire, built over generations on a foundation of fear, lies, and intimidation, had been brought down in less than 72 hours. They lost their fortune, their power, and the one thing they valued above all else, their name. Margaret filed for divorce and vanished from public life. William Vance was facing federal charges. And Caleb was facing a future in a small, cold room where his family name meant less than nothing. It was exactly as I had promised Olivia. It wasn't just payment, it was a demolition down to the bedrock. 4 months later, the first day of spring arrived in Boston not as a date on a calendar, but as a promise whispered on the wind. The air had finally lost its bitter, biting edge, carrying instead the rich scent of thawing earth and the distant hint of lilacs. It was a day for new beginnings. I stood on the sidewalk across the street, holding 2 cups of steaming coffee, and looked at the large storefront window. The sign was new, its elegant silver script glittering in the clear morning light. It read, Olivia Weller Designs. Not Vance, just her own name. A declaration. I watched her through the glass. She was inside, a smudge of white paint on her cheek, a pencil tucked behind her ear, her hair tied back in a messy but purposeful knot. She was directing 2 workmen as they positioned a large, modern light fixture, her hands moving with the confident, decisive grace of an artist in her element. My mind superimposed another image over this one, the broken, shivering girl I had carried out of that cold, dark mansion on Christmas Eve. A girl who had been made to believe she was worthless. Looking at the woman in the studio now, a woman radiating focused energy and quiet strength, it felt like I was looking at two entirely different people. I crossed the street, the small bell on the door chiming softly as I entered. She turned, and a smile spread across her face. It wasn't the fragile, hesitant smile I had seen in the weeks after the storm. This one was real, effortless. It was a radiant smile that reached her eyes, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, her eyes were no longer haunted. They were clear. They were free. "Dad," she said, her voice warm as she took the coffee from my hand. "You're just in time." "What do you think?" She gestured around the room, a space filled with light, clean lines, and boundless possibility. "I think," I said, my own voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite name, "that it's the most beautiful place I've ever seen." She took a sip of her coffee, her gaze sweeping over the sketches on her desk, the vibrant swatches of fabric. "It feels real," she said softly. "For the first time in a long time, everything feels real. I spent 30 years hunting monsters in the dark alleys of this city. I thought I knew what evil looked like, but I learned that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones who lurk in the shadows. They're the ones who live in mansions, bathed in the warm glow of public adoration. Justice, I've also learned, isn't always found in a courtroom, delivered by a judge with a gavel. Sometimes it's quieter. It's found in the slow, steady work of healing, in the courage to reclaim your own story, piece by painful piece. The Vances built an empire on power over others, but true strength, the kind that endures, is about the quiet resilience it takes to build yourself back up from the foundations. Justice, I've learned, isn't always the thunder of a gavel. Sometimes it's the quiet hum of a life being rebuilt. Seeing Olivia in her studio, surrounded by light and creation, was the only verdict that ever truly mattered. This tale of a family's fight for healing is more than just one of the many betrayal stories we see in the world. It's a testament to a father's love, the kind you often find in the most powerful grandpa stories, where wisdom and fierce protection prevail when all seems lost. Through it all, I firmly believe God grants us the strength not for simple revenge, but for the resilience to find peace on the other side of pain. So many betrayal stories end in despair, but this one is a reminder that faith can move mountains. Our channel is dedicated to sharing these kinds of powerful grandpa stories, tales that show the enduring strength of family against all odds. I truly believe God has a plan for us, even through the darkest trials. Sharing these painful betrayal stories isn't about dwelling on the past. It's about lighting a path for others. May God bless every soul who fights for what is right. What a journey we've shared today. Stories like Jason and Olivia's remind us that the deepest wounds can heal, and that the quiet strength of a parent's love can be the most powerful force on earth. If you found value in this tale, please like and share it. You never know who might need this message right now. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What did you think of Jason's final plan? And if you're not yet part of our storytelling family, subscribe and join thousands who gather here each week for stories that matter. Thank you for your time and your heart.